everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you my top tips for drawing black fur in pastels. So tip 1 is the base layer. Now the reason why I've made this my first tip is because when drawing black fur it's very tempting to put a thicker base layer down to start with. We may think at the time that we are just going to carry on adding more pan pastel, for instance if that's your method for applying your base layer, we'll just continue adding more of those darker colours for that black base layer, but what happens then is we will fill the tooth of the paper. And when you fill the tooth of the paper, you then won't be able to add any additional layers on top, which means you won't be able to add your details within the fur. So this section here for the base layer of this black Labrador that I did last year, you can see that my base layer is far from black. I'm mapping in my basic lights and darks. I've got a strong blue colour there for my base layer, but by no means is it as dark as what it's going to be when I start layering my fur with my pastel pencils. And that brings me on to tip 2, and that is that black fur is never truly black. Black fur is really reflective, so you're going to have some blues, purples and sometimes browns in there depending on the reference photo that you're working from. So take these two photos here of one of my dogs, Roxy. So the one on the left was taken on a much sunnier day, much more of that lower sunlight, and her black fur looks like it contains far more browns, some of those redder magenta colours. Whereas the photo on the right was taken on a much more overcast and cloudy day, and that black fur is far more of the neutral grey and bluer colours. So this here is a clear comparison showing just how much variety black fur can contain when it comes to the colours. When I am selecting colours, I am choosing whether or not it is a warm colour or a cool colour. Now these two side-by-side comparisons really do emphasise that. One of the most common questions I'm asked is, how do I know what colour I should pick for the fur? This is a prime example that as long as you go for close, you don't have to stress yourself out worrying about the exact colour. This photo here of Roxy, it clearly is the same dog, but the fur there looks different, especially in the black sections. Colour selection is something I go in depth on pretty much every tutorial that I've got on my Patreon channel. Because the video footage there is considerably slower, I try to keep it real time as much as I can. I'm able to then explain why I'm choosing those colours, in those instances why that colour is the better option. One last thing to mention while we're talking about colour selection is the use of an eyedropper tool. Now what this is it allows you to click anywhere on your reference photo and it will bring up a separate box showing you that exact colour. You'll then be able to more easily select the colour pencil that you need for that specific fur type, and it can make the process of colour selection less stressful. So tip 3, and that is to work from dark to light. Now whenever I'm drawing black fur, regardless of the animal, here you can see I'm working on this black and white cat, I always want to make sure that I'm starting from my dark layers and I'm building up from there gradually. I'm working from what is closest to the skin and building up from there. The lightest details that you see are often those that sit on the very top, so those are what need to be left until more towards your last couple of layers. And one of the most common questions that I'm asked is, my details don't show up. Now one of the reasons that could be why that's happening is that your base layers or the layer underneath is not dark enough. So when you're working with black fur, if you know that you're using the correct pencil in terms of how bright that pencil is, but it isn't showing up in the way that you would hope, it's usually because the base layer underneath is not dark enough. Now the other reason that can cause that, and I spoke about this in tip 1, and it's that you may have filled the tooth of the paper in that area. But if it is caused by the first reason in that the layer isn't dark enough, if you do go back in and then darken it back up, try and re-add those details and they should then be far more visible. The reason being, and I speak about this on all of my tutorials, is you've hyped up that contrast. And that brings me straight on to tip 4. Now this is something that I covered in the video I've got on YouTube on my top tips for drawing fur, which if you haven't seen that and it's of interest, I'll link that in the description below. But contrast plays such an important role when drawing fur, and especially with black fur. So Tom the Cavalier here, look at the difference. So on the left is the original drawing, and on the right I have really reduced that contrast. It's not as sharp. Now the one on the right, it does look now like grey fur rather than a black dog, which is the complete opposite of what we want. Some of the time we're too frightened to go too dark when we are drawing black fur in case we can't get it light enough again. But when that happens, the contrast is very flat, you don't have your shadows as dark as they should be, and then your highlights aren't as bright as they should be. So what can happen is you may end up with more of a result like the right hand side, where everything just looks a little bit faded and washed out. And I mentioned this in the colour selection tip, where I focus much more on my contrast rather than the exact colour, and here is the reason why. I could have the colours of Tom here slightly differently, going back to the photos of my dog Roxy, and it would still look like Tom, but the one on the right with less contrast, it doesn't have the same impact. So I would much rather my portraits focused more on that sharp contrast, and I went for as close as I could for the colour, rather than stressing myself out getting the exact colour right, but my contrasts weren't good. And when this is an issue, it clearly shows you that the black fur now just looks like a shade of grey, which is really not what we're going to be going for when we're trying to recreate black fur. So tip 5, and that is the layers. Regardless of the fur texture that I am working on, I will always add the most amount of layers that I can for the fur type that I'm creating. Now, for curly fur versus shiny short fur like a Labrador, the number of layers that are required might be slightly different, but I will always usually have a minimum of 5 or 6, and sometimes as most of as 12 to 14. The number as such isn't important, but what is important is that we are adding the right amount for the fur texture that we're trying to create. If you're finding that the fur you are drawing is flat, and this is going to be a little bit more noticeable potentially with black fur because of how the contrast is represented there, and it does go hand in hand. But if you're finding that the fur is flat, one of the main causes is that you don't have enough layers. And this section here of Oreo and the muzzle area is a prime example. This is quite a complex section. There are a lot of fur details here that are interweaved at different layers. If I just tried using 2 or 3 layers, I'm not going to have the same fur texture that I'm creating here. This fur is quite thick, it's very dense, so I want to make sure that I've got the number of layers in there to represent that. And take something like Albert here, the Staffordshire Bull Terrier, a considerably shorter fur coat that's got that shiny appearance. There may not be the same number of layers here, but there is enough. I've building up my depth gradually. What I like to do is when I'm working on a portrait like this is I will look at that section that I'm working on. I'll think, right, there are going to be thousands, tens of thousands of individual hairs here just in this one section. I don't want to draw each individual fur stroke, but I do want to make my portrait look like I have done so all through the amount of layers that I've added. And I'm not going to be able to achieve that look if I only work with 2 or 3 layers. So if you're finding the pet portrait that you're working on is not as realistic as you'd like, but it's maybe taking you just 5 hours to finish that portrait, double it. Spend another 5 hours building up more of those layers and get more of that depth in that fur. And this is something that I am really passionate about, getting that photorealistic pet portrait when I'm asked to draw someone's much loved animal. That's exactly what I want to do. So that's one of the reasons why I set up my Patreon channel, where I do predominantly focus on the pet portrait side of things. I've got various breeds, different fur types, many focus tutorials, all showing the tips and techniques from start to finish, so that any members following along who do want to do pet portraits as well for commissions and maybe turn it into a full-time job, have all of those tutorials that then make them better equipped to do so. And if my slower tutorials in pastels or acrylics are of use, I will link my Patreon channel in the description below. If you've got any questions about that, pop them in the comments or drop me a message on any of the social medias. And I also have a Patreon library on my website where you can see the full list of tutorials on each of the tiers before you sign up to see whether or not the content that I've got there is of interest to you. So I really hope the tips in this video were of use. If they were, I'd really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up, because it really does help. And if you'd like to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button. And if you've got any questions about anything covered in this video or anything else art related, don't hesitate to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video here to YouTube next week.